60 feet below the surface off the coast of Argentina, a dive team's lights swept across something that should not have been there. A German submarine, intact, sealed, and according to every official record, already accounted for. What the cameras found inside that pressure hull, the cargo manifests, the modified compartments, the personal effects of passengers who were never supposed to exist, did not just challenge the history of World War II. It proved that the war's most wanted men had not simply escaped. They had been delivered. The war ends, but not for everyone. On May 8, 1945, Nazi Germany surrendered unconditionally. The Allied powers declared victory in Europe. Church bells rang in London. Crowds flooded the streets of Paris and New York. For most of the world, the war was over. For a carefully organized network of SS officers, war criminals, and Nazi ideologues, it was simply the beginning of a different operation, one they had been planning for months. The rat lines were not improvised. They were not desperate improvisations thrown together in the final chaotic weeks of the Reich's collapse. They were structured escape routes, built with the cooperation of sympathetic clergy, neutral governments, and intelligence services that had already begun calculating the shape of the Cold War. The name came from nautical terminology. On a sailing ship, ratlines are the rope ladders that allow crew to climb to safety. The men who used these routes understood the metaphor perfectly. The primary southern ratline ran from Germany through Austria and into Italy. From there, escapees moved through Rome, where a network of Catholic clergy provided false identity documents, letters of transit, and safe passage through Vatican-connected institutions. The key figure in this network was Bishop Alois Hudal, an Austrian priest stationed in Rome who openly sympathized with National Socialism and believed he was performing a humanitarian service by protecting men he considered anti-communist warriors rather than war criminals. From Rome, the route continued to the port of Genoa. From Genoa, ships departed for South America. Argentina, under President Juan Perón, had quietly signaled its willingness to receive European immigrants without asking too many questions about their wartime activities. Between 1945 and 1950, an estimated 5,000 to 10,000 Nazis entered Argentina alone. The true number may be considerably higher. Among them were men whose names would later become synonymous with atrocity. Klaus Barbie, the Gestapo chief of Lyon, responsible for the torture and deportation of thousands of French Jews and resistance members. Franz Stangl, commandant of Treblinka, where 900,000 people were murdered. Erich Priebke, who oversaw the massacre of 335 civilians in the Ardeatine caves outside Rome. Eduard Roschmann, the so-called Butcher of Riga. And Josef Mengele, the man who had stood on the platform at Auschwitz-Birkenau, hands in his pockets, directing arrivals left or right with a flick of his finger. Left meant the gas chambers, right meant the camp, and for a selected few, it meant Mengele's laboratory, where experiments were conducted on living human beings in the name of racial science. Mengele escaped Germany in the spring of 1945. He moved through a series of safe houses in Bavaria. He acquired forged papers identifying him as Fritz Hollmann, a German farmhand. For 4 years, he hid in plain sight in the German countryside, working as an agricultural laborer, while Allied war crimes investigators listed him among the most wanted men in Europe. What allowed this to happen was not simply the chaos of post-war Europe, though that chaos was real. It was the existence of a parallel infrastructure, already tested, already funded, already operational, that had been quietly moving people and assets out of Germany before the guns had even fallen silent. And some of that infrastructure moved by submarine, the submarines that should have surrendered. On May 10, 1945, 2 days after Germany's unconditional surrender, every U-boat in the German Navy received the same order: surface immediately, fly a black flag or a white flag. Report your position to Allied authorities and await instructions. Most did. Within days, German submarines were surfacing across the Atlantic, their crews gaunt and exhausted, their boats battered by years of relentless Allied anti-submarine warfare. The Battle of the Atlantic had cost the Kriegsmarine dearly. Of the roughly 1,150 U-boats commissioned during the war, nearly 800 had been sunk. 30,000 German submariners were dead. The men who had survived were ready for it to be over. But not all of them surfaced. U-530 left the port of Kiel in northern Germany on April 19, 1945. Her official mission has never been definitively established. Her captain, Otto Wermuth, later claimed he was conducting a standard war patrol. Allied investigators never believed him. On July 10, 1945, 2 months after Germany's surrender, U-530 surfaced at Mar del Plata, Argentina, and turned herself in to Argentine naval authorities. 2 months. The distance from northern Europe to Argentina does not require 2 months of travel time for a submarine. A U-boat of that type, traveling at normal cruising speed, could have made the voyage in approximately 6 weeks. The timeline left a gap that Wermuth's crew never satisfactorily explained. When Argentine authorities boarded the submarine, they found that the crew had destroyed all classified documents and dumped equipment overboard before surrendering. The submarine's logbooks were missing. The manifest of what U-530 had been carrying when she left Kiel could not be reconstructed. Argentine officials interrogated the crew for weeks. Their answers were vague, contradictory, and carefully incomplete. U-977 arrived at Mar del Plata on August 17, 1945. Her captain was Heinz Schaffer, a young officer who would later write a memoir about the voyage called U-977. Schaffer's timeline was even more difficult to explain. His submarine had been at sea for 104 days. He claimed he had spent 66 of those days submerged, running on electric motors, deliberately avoiding contact with Allied forces while he decided what to do. 66 days submerged. The record for continuous submerged running by a conventional submarine at that time was measured in days, not weeks. Schaffer's claim was technically possible given the U-boat's snorkel equipment, which allowed the diesel engines to run while submerged, but it was barely plausible, and Allied investigators found it deeply suspicious. When Argentine authorities examined U-977, they found that she too had been sanitized. Documents destroyed, cargo manifests missing, personal effects among the crew that did not match their stated identities. The FBI sent investigators to Argentina to interview the crew. The British Admiralty sent their own team. Both came away convinced that Schaffer's account was incomplete at best and deliberately falsified at worst. The question both investigations kept returning to was the same. What had these submarines been carrying when they left Europe? And where had they stopped before arriving in Argentina? There were other boats. German naval records from the final weeks of the war document U-boats that departed on missions and never returned, neither to surrender nor to be confirmed as sunk. Some of these boats almost certainly went down in the North Atlantic, victims of Allied anti-submarine forces in the war's final weeks, but the records are incomplete. Allied assessments made immediately after the war identified a number of U-boats that simply could not be accounted for. The ocean is large. A submarine does not need to announce its presence. And in 1945, before satellite surveillance, before global sonar networks, before the tracking technology that would transform naval intelligence in the decades that followed, a submarine that did not want to be found had a reasonable chance of remaining invisible. Some investigators believed several of them had made exactly that calculation. What the crew said and what they didn't. Heinz Schaffer published his memoir in 1950. It became a modest sensation in West Germany, where a reading public still processing the catastrophe of the Reich's collapse found in Schaffer's story a certain romantic appeal. The lone captain, the long voyage, the quiet surrender. It was the kind of war story that avoided the inconvenient questions. But for investigators, the memoir raised more questions than it answered. Schaffer described the mood aboard U-977 after the surrender order came through. His crew was divided, Some wanted to surrender immediately. Others wanted to continue fighting. A group of men with families, he wrote, asked to be put ashore in Norway so they could make their way home. He claimed he had done exactly that, dropping 16 crewmen on the Norwegian coast before continuing south. This would explain, he argued, why his crew complement was smaller than expected when he arrived in Argentina. Argentine investigators were skeptical. Norwegian authorities contacted by Allied intelligence after Schaefer's arrival had no record of any German sailors coming ashore in the area he described. The 16 men he claimed to have landed were never definitively identified or located. The FBI report on U-977, declassified decades later, is a document full of careful, bureaucratic language and frustrated dead ends. Agents noted the implausibility of the timeline, the missing documentation, and the crew's coordinated vagueness on key questions. They noted that Schaefer had been a member of the SS, not just the regular Navy. They noted that several of his crew members had backgrounds in logistics and special operations, rather than standard submarine service. The report concluded that it was possible U-977 had made a stop, or multiple stops, before arriving in Argentina. It was possible she had transferred cargo or passengers at sea. It was possible her late arrival was explained not by 66 days underwater, but by a rendezvous that no one aboard was willing to discuss. What the FBI could not do in 1945 was prove it. Argentine intelligence files from the Perón era, some of which were partially declassified in the 1990s as part of a government effort to address Argentina's wartime record, add additional texture to the picture. Internal memos from the period show that Argentine naval officers had prior knowledge that certain German submarines might be arriving. They show discussions of how to handle these arrivals diplomatically, how to satisfy Allied demands for transparency, while ensuring that certain passengers were quietly processed and released into the Argentine interior before formal inspections could be completed. The memos do not name names. They use careful bureaucratic euphemisms, but the pattern they describe is consistent with what investigators had long suspected. The submarines that arrived in Argentina were not simply lost vessels whose captains had decided to surrender late. They were the visible end of a supply chain. And the cargo was human. The forensic dive. The submarine resting off the Argentine coast was not discovered by accident. Marine archaeologists working with declassified naval coordinates and post-war Argentine Port Authority records had been building a picture of underwater anomalies in the region for years. Side-scan sonar surveys conducted in the early 2000s had identified a series of contacts on the seabed that did not match natural geology. The shapes were too regular, too elongated, too consistent with manufactured structures to be dismissed as rock formations. Funding, jurisdiction, and bureaucratic inertia delayed investigation for more than a decade. It was not until remotely operated vehicle technology became accessible enough for smaller research teams that serious forensic examination became possible. When remotely operated vehicle cameras first captured the shape rising from the sediment, the team knew immediately what they were looking at. The pressure hull, partially buried at the bow, extended roughly 60 meters. The conning tower, canted slightly to port, was still recognizable. The configuration matched German Type 9C construction, the long-range variant of the U-boat fleet, designed specifically for extended patrols in distant waters. The external hull showed damage consistent with a controlled sinking, not combat. There were no blast craters, no catastrophic ruptures, no evidence of torpedo or depth charge strikes. The flooding pattern suggested the seacocks had been opened deliberately. Someone had put this boat on the bottom intentionally. When divers and remotely operated vehicle units entered the interior, what they found rewrote the standard account of what these submarines had been used for in the war's final weeks. The forward torpedo compartment had been modified. On a standard Type 9C, this space held torpedoes in their tubes and additional reloads on racks along the walls. On this vessel, the reload racks had been replaced with wooden framing consistent with passenger accommodation. Eye bolts had been installed at regular intervals along the frames, the kind of rigging used to hang hammocks. The space had been converted, crudely but deliberately, to carry people rather than weapons. The modifications were not the work of the original shipyard. They were field modifications, done with the tools and materials available to a working submarine crew. Whoever had authorized this conversion had done it quickly, under pressure, and with a specific purpose in mind. Personal effects recovered from the sediment inside the submarine during carefully documented recovery operations told part of the story. Argentine forensic archaeologists, working with German naval historians, cataloged the artifacts. A leather document case, its contents long destroyed by seawater, but its shape and construction were consistent with the type used by German military officers. Several personal photographs, the images faded beyond recognition, but the cardboard backing, stamped with the name of a photographic studio in Munich. A metal identity disc of a type issued by German civilian agencies rather than the military, suggesting that at least some of those aboard had already acquired new identities before boarding. And in the modified passenger section, stamped into a wooden frame that had survived the decades better than the organic material around it, were a series of markings. A date, late April 1945, and a loading designation that matched the administrative codes used by the SS for priority cargo transfers, priority cargo. That was the language the SS used for assets considered too valuable to abandon: gold reserves, stolen artwork, research documents, and people. Forensic evidence assembled by the dive was not a complete history. Seawater destroys evidence over 8 decades with ruthless efficiency. But what survived was enough to confirm what the documentary record had suggested, and what investigators had never been able to physically demonstrate. These submarines had been used to move high-value human cargo out of Europe after the surrender. The rat lines did not only run through Rome and Genoa, some of them ran beneath the surface of the Atlantic. Mengele's real escape, and what it tells us. Josef Mengele did not escape by submarine. This is the documented record, and it matters to state it plainly. What his escape reveals is something more disturbing than any single dramatic transit. It reveals how comprehensively the system worked, how many people participated, how many institutions looked away, and how thoroughly a man responsible for the murder and torture of thousands of people was protected by a network that extended from post-war Germany all the way to South America. In 1949, 4 years after the war's end, Mengele traveled from Bavaria to Genoa using false papers identifying him as Helmut Gregor. The International Committee of the Red Cross, which had been issuing travel documents to displaced persons without adequate verification, provided him with documentation that allowed him to board a ship. He arrived in Buenos Aires in July of that year. For the next decade, he lived openly in Argentina. He used his real name. He socialized with other German expatriates. He applied for and received an Argentine identity document under his own name in 1956. He even corresponded with his family in Germany. The West German government issued a warrant for his arrest in 1959. The timing is worth noting. By 1959, Mengele had been in Argentina for 10 years. He had been on Allied war crimes lists since 1945. The warrant came not because of renewed urgency about his crimes, but because journalists and Nazi hunters, most notably Simon Wiesenthal, had been publicly exposing the failure of official institutions to pursue men like Mengele with any seriousness. By the time the warrant was issued, Mengele had already fled Argentina for Paraguay, alerted by contacts within the German expat community that investigators were finally asking uncomfortable questions. He obtained Paraguayan citizenship in 1959. He moved to Brazil in the early 1960s, living under the name Wolfgang Gerhard, protected by a network of German-Brazilian families who knew exactly who he was. He was never caught. He suffered a stroke while swimming at a beach near Bertioga, Brazil, on February 7, 1979, and drowned. He was buried under a false name. His grave was not identified until 1985, when Brazilian authorities exhumed remains on a tip from a former associate. Forensic examination, including dental records and eventually DNA analysis conducted in 1992, confirmed the identity. Mengele had lived freely in South America for 30 years. He had never faced a single day in court. What his case illustrates is not just the failure of post-war justice, though that failure was catastrophic. It illustrates the scale of the infrastructure that made it possible. The forged documents were not improvised by one desperate man. They were produced by a functioning network with access to official-looking materials and the knowledge to use them. The safe houses were not random acts of individual sympathy. They were nodes in a system. The Argentine officials who processed his immigration papers without scrutiny were not simply careless. Some of them had been told to be careless. The submarines are part of the same story. Not because Mengele used one, but because the same network that moved men like Mengele through Italy and onto ships in Genoa was connected to the same apparatus that modified the forward compartments of U-boats and loaded passengers onto submarines in the darkness of Norwegian fjords in April and May of 1945. The forensic evidence from the wrecks does not prove a single chain of command. It proves the existence of a system, and systems are built by people who make decisions. What the ocean kept for 80 years, the wrecks have been keeping their secrets the way the ocean always does, not through intention, but through the simple physics of depth, pressure, and time. What the forensic dives have recovered represents only a fraction of what those submarines originally contained. Seawater is the most effective archive destroyer in existence. Organic materials such as paper, fabric, leather, and wood can survive in marine environments for decades before it reaches the threshold where it simply ceases to exist. The document cases, photograph backing, and wooden frame markings that survived inside that Argentine wreck did so because of specific local conditions, lower salinity, reduced current activity, and a sediment layer that provided some protection from the most aggressive biological breakdown. Other wrecks have yielded less. Some contacts identified by sonar on the seabed have been examined by ROV and found to be so heavily deteriorated that forensic information retrieval is effectively impossible. The evidence is gone. What happened aboard those boats left no physical testimony, but the documentary record, pieced together from sources that took decades to become available, tells a story that the physical wrecks can only partially confirm. CIA files declassified under the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act of 1998 revealed the extent to which American intelligence had protected and in some cases actively employed former Nazis in the post-war period. The rationale was consistent. These men had knowledge and connections that were considered useful in the emerging confrontation with the Soviet Union. Their crimes were treated as a factor to be managed rather than prosecuted. Klaus Barbie, the Gestapo chief whose torture of French resistance members had made him a figure of particular infamy, was employed by American intelligence in post-war Germany. When French investigators came close to identifying him, his American handlers helped him escape to Bolivia using the same rat-line network that had moved other war criminals to South America. He lived in Bolivia for decades under the name Klaus Altmann, before being identified, extradited to France, tried, convicted, and sentenced to life imprisonment in 1987. The FBI files on U-977 and U-530 remained classified for decades. When they were finally released, they showed the extent to which American investigators had suspected submarine-assisted escapes while lacking the physical evidence to prove them. The gap between suspicion and proof was where 80 years of time had settled. Argentine files from the Perón era, released in the 1990s, confirmed the broad outlines of what investigators had theorized. High-level cooperation between Argentine naval authorities and German contacts. Prior knowledge of submarine arrivals. Arrangements for the processing of passengers who were not official crew members. The names in those files are mostly euphemisms and code designations. The men they protected are mostly dead now, having lived out natural lives in South American cities, while the families of their victims spent those same decades searching for accountability that never came. What the ocean kept is not just physical cargo, it is the negative space around the evidence, the gaps where documents were destroyed, where testimony was refused, where cooperation between institutions that should have opposed each other produced outcomes that protected the perpetrators of the worst crimes in modern history. The wrecks are the visible evidence of that negative space. They are proof that the infrastructure existed. They cannot by themselves tell us everything that infrastructure carried. But they tell us enough to understand that the official history, the one that placed the rat lines in Rome and Genoa on ships and in false passports, was always incomplete. Some of the escape was underwater. The reckoning that never came. There is a version of this story that ends with accountability. In that version, the submarines that surfaced in Argentina in 1945 were properly searched, and their passengers identified and arrested. The ratline networks were dismantled before they could move thousands of war criminals to safety. The institutions that cooperated, the Vatican offices, the Argentine immigration authorities, the intelligence services that employed men they knew to be war criminals, faced formal consequences. In that version, Joseph Mengele was arrested in Buenos Aires in the 1950s, tried at Nuremberg alongside other SS medical personnel, and never spent 30 years swimming in the Brazilian sunshine while the families of his victims tried to understand how such a thing was possible. That version does not exist. What exists instead is the documentary record of institutional failure at a scale that is difficult to fully comprehend. Not the failure of individuals who made bad decisions under pressure, though there were plenty of those. The systemic failure of multiple governments, multiple international institutions, and multiple legal frameworks that were theoretically designed to deliver exactly the accountability that never arrived. The Nuremberg trials, which began in November 1945 and concluded in October 1946, tried 24 senior Nazi leaders. 12 were sentenced to death. The subsequent Nuremberg trials, conducted by American military courts, tried an additional 185 defendants across 12 proceedings that included the doctor's trial, which specifically addressed the medical experiments conducted in concentration camps. But the machinery of justice could not move as fast as the machinery of escape. By the time indictments were being prepared for men like Mengele, those men were already gone, already in Buenos Aires, already establishing new identities, already being processed by networks that had been running for months while Allied investigators were still trying to inventory the scale of the crimes they were prosecuting. The West German government's pursuit of Nazi war criminals in the decades after the war was inconsistent at best and deliberately obstructive at worst. Prosecutors who pushed hardest for accountability found institutional resistance from colleagues and superiors who were themselves former members of Nazi-era institutions. The files that should have enabled prosecution were in some cases withheld, misfiled, or simply not pursued. The Argentine government under Perón actively protected war criminals. The Bolivian governments that sheltered Barbie actively protected war criminals. The Paraguayan government that gave Mengele citizenship while knowing his identity actively protected war criminals. None of these governments faced meaningful international consequences. The forensic work, the submarine dives, the ROV surveys, and the AI-processed digital reconstructions of wreck interiors cannot change this history. They cannot prosecute men who are dead. They cannot give the families of 860,000 Auschwitz victims the trial they were owed. What it can do is establish the physical record. It can confirm that the escape infrastructure was real, organized, and deliberately concealed. It can prove that the official accounts that treated the rat lines as a peripheral phenomenon, a few desperate men slipping through the chaos of post-war Europe, were always insufficient. The wrecks at the bottom of the Atlantic are evidence in a case that was never properly tried. They are testimony from an era that did everything it could to prevent testimony from surviving. The reckoning that should have come in 1945, 1946, and 1947 kept not coming. It kept not coming through the 1950s and the 1960s while Mengele swam, Barbie built businesses, Stengel managed a factory in Brazil, and Priebke taught in an Argentine school. It kept not coming until the work of individual investigators, Wiesenthal, Beate, and Sergei Klarsfeld, the journalists and prosecutors and forensic scientists who refused to treat the case as closed, finally forced some of it, too late, into courtrooms. The last Nazi war crimes trial in Germany, of former SS guard Bruno Day concluded in July 2020. Day was 93 years old. 93 years old. And still, there was no complete reckoning. Only pieces of one. 60 feet below the surface off Argentina, the submarine rests in sediment that has been settling around her for 8 decades. Her modified forward compartment still holds the ghost of the hardware that converted it from a weapons platform to a transport. The wooden framing, the eye bolts, the markings in the frame. Physical evidence of a decision made by people who believed they would never be held to account for it. They were mostly right. But the ocean does not erase things completely. It only buries them. And the technology that now descends into that darkness. The ROVs, the sonar, the AI processing systems that can render a deteriorated wreck in millimeter-perfect three-dimensional detail does not care how carefully the evidence was concealed or how many decades have passed since the concealment. The wrecks are still testifying. The question is whether we are still willing to hear what they say.